Good evening, everybody. People are still flowing into the webinar, so we're just going to give a few moments for all the guests to populate and get in here. We'll get started shortly. All right, so we've got a good bit in here. It's also late, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everybody. This is Introducing A Changing Delmarva, a free workshop presented by Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. My name is Darius Johnson. I'm Eastern Shore Land Conservancy Communications Manager. And first off, I just want to say thank you all so much just for the outpour of interest and support in this workshop series. We're really grateful for the attendance that we have here tonight. I know people are still flowing in. We have over 100 participants in here right now, and we had over 250 signed up, more than 200 for the entire workshop series. So clearly this is a really important topic to each of you. And I'm just excited to introduce our amazing speakers to you all tonight. I think it'll be an amazing opportunity for, just shared learning and partnership with a lot of great opportunity to come after this series. So like I said, it's late, don't want to waste too much time, but what I do want to do is just go over some quick housekeeping elements. Obviously, you can see us, but we can't see you. This is a view-only webinar for attendees, but we do encourage you to attempt to engage with the speakers as much as possible. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat feature, and you'll see the question and answer feature. Eastern Shore Land Conservancy staff are on hand just to monitor both of those and make sure that any questions or comments gets addressed in the Q&A portion of each presentation. So again, please don't be shy about sharing any insights, comments, or just general things that excite you about the Delmarva Peninsula. We really want this to be an as engaging thing as possible. I also want to give a quick overview of tonight's agenda. You all should have received an email about an hour ago with just a really, more in detail agenda of tonight's events, tonight's sections. But, this is just an abbreviated overview of what's going on. So I think we have a really good, workshop prepared for you all tonight, and we're really looking forward to what's to come of it. But before we dive into it, I just want to take a moment to share a little bit about Eastern Shore Land Conservancy and who we are for those that don't know us. So Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, we were founded in 1990, and our mission is to preserve and sustain the vibrant communities of Maryland's Eastern Shore and the lands and waters that connect them. So we've been doing that, working across 6 counties, going from Cecil County down to Dorchester County, and we've been blessed to be able to protect over 65,000 acres of land throughout the entire lifetime of our organization. And throughout the organization's lifetime, we've really built a strong programmatic focus on protected land, thriving towns, and resilient people. And what you'll come to find tonight and throughout this series is that all of these programs kind of come under one umbrella under our initiative called Delmarva Oasis, which is our initiative to protect 50% of the Delmarva Peninsula by 2030. So this is the first workshop where we're really, bringing Delmarva Oasis to the forefront, introducing it to the public. And we're doing it with some great supporters and partners that we're, really blessed and grateful to have here tonight. But with that said, I want to introduce my colleague, Jim Bass, ESLC's Coastal Resilience Program Manager, where he's just going to share a bit more about the overall workshop series and how it relates to Delmarva Oasis. Jim?
Thank you, Darius. So as the other 120 people here in the workshop this evening probably know, climate change and coastal resilience issues are a big part of the sort of existential threat of life here on the Delmarva Peninsula. So over the course of this series of 4 workshops, we hope to inform and educate people about climate change. But there are so many opportunities out there to really to hear bad news. And one thing that we don't want to do with this workshop series is make it a bummer. You know, everybody is giving us lots of time and lots of energy from their own personal lives. So we want to make sure that everybody finds this fulfilling and exciting, and we want to instill hope because there's so many good opportunities to create a better tomorrow and protect land and create a better environment for ourselves and for native species here on the Delmarva Peninsula. There are just so many opportunities out there, and this workshop series is a great way of doing that. We're going to be talking about some big concepts, and we're going to be talking about actions that everyone individually can be taking. And we hope that this 4-part workshop series is helpful for you and really shows you ways that you can get involved and make a difference. We couldn't do this workshop series without the generous support of our friends at the Roush Foundation. So we really appreciate that. We're excited to be bringing this workshop series to you. And as Darius touched on earlier, we want this to be a back and forth between our presenters and the participants this evening. The same goes for the entire workshop series. So as you guys have ideas about how we can make small tweaks to these workshops to improve in subsequent workshops, please be in touch with us. As part of the agenda that goes out, you should get contact information for Darius, myself, and others at ESLC. You can also get in touch with us through our website. So if you have ideas or you want to express support in any sort of way, please don't hesitate to be in touch. We are really grateful for your support. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Darius?
All right, thanks, Jim. All right, so with that being said, I want to introduce tonight's featured speakers, Dr. Paula J. Ehrlich, President and CEO of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation and the lead for the Half Earth Project, and Dr. Don Boesch, Professor and President Emeritus at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. So Paula, she's going to be first up. Sorry about that. She's going to be first up. So what I want to do is just read you a brief biography of her so you can get to know her a little bit better. So Paula, she oversees the E.O. Wilson Foundation's broad activities to foster a knowing stewardship of our world through research and education initiatives that promote and inform worldwide protection of biodiversity. Dr. Ehrlich leads the Half Earth Project, which is driving the research needed to better understand and care for her world, providing leadership to guide conservation efforts, and engaging people to participate broadly in the goal to conserve half of the earth and protect the bulk of biodiversity. So Paula, do you mind turning your camera on for a second? And if there's anything that you'd like to share before we pull up this video that you wanted to present with everybody?
Hey Darius, thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming tonight and for inviting me to share the work of our foundation and the work of the Half Earth Project. Darius is going to start out just to orient you to our work by showing a short video about the Half Earth Project.
Is that okay now?
Threats to the natural world are multiplying. Species are going extinct at an alarming rate.
Unless we move quickly to protect global biodiversity, we will soon lose most of the species composing life on Earth.
But there's a solution. It's called Half Earth. If we conserve half the land and sea, we can still safeguard the bulk of our planet's biodiversity. But what would Half Earth look like? How do we get there? By mapping our planet's biodiversity in fine detail, and in relation to human activities, we can pinpoint the best places to conserve the maximum number of species. Mindful of our ever-changing world, we can identify wildlife corridors and other management solutions that can help sustain biodiversity. With the right information to guide effective conservation efforts, we have the opportunity to support the most biodiverse places in the world, as well as the people who call these paradises home. The Half-Earth Project is working to engage people everywhere in why these places are special and how they can best be managed to protect life on Earth. Through cutting-edge technology, we're mapping the magnificent global web of biodiversity with unprecedented resolution and providing scientific leadership and actionable guidance for conservation to achieve the goal of Half-Earth.
We can share this precious planet of ours. All life can prosper. It would be humanity's greatest achievement.
Can we really save half the Earth? Yes, we can if we want to.
All right, Paula, it's all yours. Thank you for that video.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for your patience in watching that short sizzle piece about the Half-Earth Project. I'm here this evening to kind of kick things off and really talk about the importance of protecting nature. And it's an interesting time to be speaking with you, a time when we're all leaning forward with renewed awareness that human fate is dependent in the long and short term on the care and maintenance of our planet. My sense is that we're witnessing a heightened cultural awareness of the need for a hopeful solution for our planet, a way by which living Earth, all of it, can continue to breathe. And in the book Half-Earth, E.O. Wilson created a promise that if we achieve the goal of Half-Earth, to protect half the Earth in order to safeguard the bulk of biodiversity, that we'd solve a problem and living Earth, all of it, could continue to breathe. That problem is this. It's estimated that we'll lose half our planet's species by the end of the century. And this is because the extinction rate is currently 1,000 times higher than at any time in human history. In May of 2019, the United Nations issued an apocalyptic report about mass extinction. The report warned that animal species were at risk of extinction. 1 million, it's kind of hard to even fathom, right? Countless living creatures, individual frogs and bats and turtles and tigers and bees and eels and puffins and owls. Each one, right, like you or me, each with its own life story and family ties, an ecosystem of codependent friends. Extinction like that has been sort of unfolding off stage. So when these huge numbers were reported, people sort of gasped in surprise, right? But what happens when it's right in front of our faces? And I was struck by a story in Sunday's New York Times. A story was told and a question was asked. What happens when the last 2 northern white rhinos dies? And why does it matter? This is a photo of them, a mother and her daughter. Well, it matters surely because somewhere in the core of our humanity, we recognize these as great creatures. And when we're touched by their story, we feel extraordinary compassion. It also matters because the species of our planet don't really exist in isolation. The answer is if we lose species, we lose ecosystem, that web of life that sustains nature and sustains us as part of nature. And as the author Sam Anderson wrote, a rhino's not just a rhino, right? It's a load-bearing strand in an elaborate ecological web. A rhino is not just a part of the world, it is a world. It mows and plows fields. Its dung feeds colonies of insects, and birds come to feed on the insects, and other predators come to catch the birds. And it's an ecosystem of its own. And we too are part of that web. And sooner or later, our strand will be cut. It's like a game of Jenga. You're never exactly sure when you cause the whole to collapse. And here's the tricky thing. The game of Jenga is played with 54 wooden blocks. Our planet is made up of something more like 10 million species. And we only know and have a name for 2 million of them. So even if we try to be strategically smart about which ones it might be okay to lose, we know only 20% of the players on the field and very little about their connections with the 8 million others that are unknown. So you might say we're playing a little in the dark, right? In our attempts to care for our planet. And as E.O. Wilson says, unless humanity learns a great deal more about global biodiversity and to protect, we'll soon lose most of the species composing life on Earth. You see, we've worked earnestly, but global conservation efforts have lowered extinction rates of species by only about 20%. And E.O. Wilson tells a funny story that speaks to this. It's like a surgeon hovering over a bleeding patient in the operating room. And the surgeon heroically stops 20% of the bleeding, right? But there's a problem, right? I mean, congratulations, the patient's still dead in the morning. And if present conditions persist, we'll lose half of all species before the end of the century. So Half Earth is about solving this problem. The idea is to raise our ambition to a new level, from a process that has been somewhat successful to a goal, protection of half the land and sea, that we will all work together to achieve. And if we accomplish this goal, we'll have managed sufficient habitat to safeguard the bulk of biodiversity. And this is a big deal. It's not just important conceptually or scientifically, it's important inspirationally. Because if you look at history, this is the sort of ambition, this is the sort of moonshot goal that drives humanity. So why half? Well, the consensus that emerged around the idea of half being the solution is kind of extraordinary because, well, inevitably, scientific consensus is extraordinary. But the thing that E.O. Wilson is most famous for is influencing our lives. And I've found that's worth paying attention to. So the scientific principle behind the idea of half-Earth actually grows out of some research that E.O. Wilson did as a young man. This is him as a young man. And that research showed that as the size of an island grows, the diversity of life surviving on the island also grew, and also that it grew in a mathematically predictable way. It's related to that's on the quiz. And if you look at the curve predicted by this relationship, you have a pretty good idea that if we protect half, we'll be able to protect and safeguard the bulk of biodiversity. So in this curve, once we hit half, most of species are saved. Now, the key is to map the species of our planet at a high enough resolution that we have the opportunity we need to identify the places that have the best opportunity to protect the most species. And that's what we're doing here with the Half-Earth Project map. In fact, using geospatial species data, our team has determined that 48.5% of land is sufficient to meet conservation targets for all of the 32,000 terrestrial vertebrate species that we know. The key is to pick that half really well. And so we've used the Half-Earth map to help people imagine together what half could look like, to showcase the most effective path forward for protection of endangered species and endangered ecosystems. And this is providing the foundation for a new way of understanding how to best steward biodiversity, also supporting decision, and creating a really rich experience about why these places are special, to help people understand and care, to move us from the science towards action. Right? But not all halves are created equal. So if the goal of half is ultimately to leave no species behind, we need an indicator of how well conserved places are doing in protecting the species of their place and where we have the best opportunities to protect more, right? So our team has developed what we call a Species Protection Index, an SPI. Think of it as like the FICA score for biodiversity, okay? Right now, you can go on the Half-Earth Project map and see an SPI national for every nation. And you can get an SPI score of from 0 to 100, depending upon how many species groups are protected in your country. Now, the average is about 41 for most countries. And you get 100 if you've reached conservation targets for all your country's species within your protected areas. So here, check out like Israel, which has an SPI that's about average, right? 41. And it has 16% of its land in protected areas. If you take a look at this list, you can see Israel down here. It's ranked 116 of 252 countries. And the US is up here, it's ranked 94. So here's how this works. Let's compare Mongolia up on the top, right, with Israel. Mongolia has also protected 16% of its land, but it has a blockbuster SBI of 89.14. Now, this lets us know that Mongolia is doing really well in successfully achieving species conservation in the places it's protected. Indicators like the Species Protection Index are key, right? Because the double bottom line is really how well you are protecting species within conserved areas. And this is what we need to measure success. But not all's lost for Israel. Israel's national report card also shows where to go next, with one possible configuration of additional areas to protect in pursuit of the half-earth shown here. Now, protection of the yellow areas will contribute more to the conservation of species habitat beyond the current protection, which is in green. The double bottom line is to make sure that land is protected that protects species. So this is why the SPI has been proposed as one of the headline indicators by the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity. It's to make sure we can measure our success so that we have a better chance of actually getting there. Now, there are many people on this call who are dedicated to the expansion of conservation efforts, and to you, we all owe a huge debt of gratitude. Now, these sorts of indices, such as Species Protection Index, are in the national report cards on the Half-Earth Project map, could be replicated at a state level. And of course, you can replicate this concept regionally with your own richer information from state agencies and the USGS. In many big and small ways, the efforts of the ESLC are already contributing to the half-Earth goal. And as Virgil says in the epigraph to the book Half-Earth, now we have come a long way. And now the time has come to unyoke our steaming horses. What it meant, when E.O. Wilson meant, when he put this in the epigraph of the book, is that we kind of know what we need to do now. We just need to move forward in making this happen. And remember, when John F. Kennedy announced the space program, he did not say to the American people, by the end of this decade, we'll have made good progress towards landing a man on the moon and bringing him home. He said, by the end of this decade, we'll send a 300-foot rocket on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body 240,000 miles away, and then return it safely to Earth, right? And our collective imagination exploded. We can do it, right? And when we do it, we'll have solved this immense problem, have learned so much more and done so much more for humanity. And that's what Half-Earth is. It's a goal that's meant to inspire us in the same way, right? We know that if we reach half, we'll save the bulk of biodiversity and we can relax. We won't have to struggle so much every day. We will have arrived, and living Earth, all of it, can continue to breathe. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Paula. I just want to say that, this work is really inspirational, and of course, it's the backbone for our Delmarva and Oasis initiative. So we really appreciate you sharing this with us today. We actually do have 2 questions in the chat that I'll pose to you if you don't mind answering those. So the first is from Nick hopefully I'm pronouncing their last name right, Nick Pasquale. Sorry about that. He asks, how do you distinguish between human-induced extinction from natural extinction for the purposes of the Half Earth Project?
Well, you bring up a great point, right? Species do naturally go extinct. The difference here is the rate. Since people came on the planet, that rate of extinction, which had a normal background rhythm, if you will, has increased to 1,000 times higher than before people came on the planet. Now, there's a lot of complex science that goes into that, but the message really of the Half Earth Project is we got to do something different, right? And so the idea is that we need to set a goal that we can all work together on in order to drive that back to a normal background.
Thank you. So I know you said we need a goal that we all can work together on. I think this is an interesting question as a follow-up from that, from Tammy Truitt. And she said that I hosted a Mongolian student who said his city was the most polluted city on earth, a city that was home to more than 50% of their population. So does this mean that other species are worth saving more than humans?
Gosh, no. Not at all. And Half Earth by no means is meant to displace people or the importance of them in their own environments and in their own lives. And that's why I spent some time really carefully trying to show you what it would look like, where we are living sustainably, not only on the planet on behalf of other species, but in really in support of ourselves. Half Earth is not just about large landscape conservation, but conservation and awareness of the issues of sustainability within our cities and our communities and more regionally as well. It's really about a change in mindset, right? Where we get a better sense of, well, our core humanity and the sense that this is our home and that we should take care of it for the species of our planet and for our own children and grandchildren.
Right, totally agree. So I think we have one more question for you, Paula. This is from Jason. He says, he asks, aside from park establishment by government and purchase of development rights by land trust, what other approaches can be used to achieve this effort?
They're as big as you can imagine. So, of course, there are community conservation efforts, including indigenous community conservation efforts that we should honor, if not revere, because they're the original conservationists. So we should pay attention to where people are already living on the land sustainably. And this can include farmers and other folks who know the land and can also incorporate best practices in order to best support the biodiversity of our planet. It can happen in big and small ways, in school community gardens, and across private and public efforts as well.
Awesome, thank you. Well, Paula, it looks like we don't have any other questions, but again, we really appreciate you sharing the Half Earth Project with us tonight. Again, it is really inspirational, and I think it's ambition that we all should strive to achieve collectively. So again, thank you so much.
Absolutely, really a pleasure.
All right, so with that being said, I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Donald Boesch. So I'm gonna read his bio really quick. So Dr. Don Boesch is well known to many of us in Delmarva because of his 27 years service as a president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. A longer bio included with the agenda provides more information on his many accomplishments, particularly relevant for tonight's workshop. He served for 10 years on the Maryland Commission for Climate Change. So with that being said, I want to introduce Mr. Donald Boesch, and Don, take it away. It's all yours.
Great, thanks so much. And it's really a pleasure to be with everyone tonight. And I appreciate your turning out for this. Let me just say, first of all, I have great respect for the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. Former Governor Harry Hughes and Russ Brinsfield, who were the people who got together and started this, were dear friends of mine, and Rob Etkin has just done a great job of carrying it forward. So that's my first honor. The other one is being on this panel with Paula, not only because I've gotten to know her briefly, but also because E.O. Wilson is one of my heroes. Ed Wilson, very famous biologist, probably one of the world's most famous biologists, grew up like I did on the Gulf Coast. He grew up in Mobile some years before me, and I grew up in New Orleans. And we both kind of developed our worldview by going out and working in the environment of the Gulf Coast. So he's long been a hero of mine. So let me see if I can start the slides, and then we can go from there. So what I was asked to talk about in this introduction to a changing Delmarva is climate change. And specifically, since we have a limited amount of time, I was directed to talk about sea level rise. I'll talk about climate change more generally in a bit, but I want to focus a bit on a concern that many people on the Eastern Shore have, and Delmarva have, and that is climate change, because you live on this low-lying peninsula surrounded by the ocean and the bays, the Delaware and Chesapeake Bay. Let's see, play from here. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, since we have limited time, is just to basically make sure we all understand the facts. Evidence and facts are important these days. In particular, there is unequivocal global warming. And if you haven't seen the news, the data are in, at least from one source, the European group that collects world temperature data. And now it appears to be, based upon their analysis, that 2020 was tied with 2016 for the warmest year ever measured since humans have been measuring temperature around the world. That's significant, not only because it's the warmest year, but because actually, if you look at this chart, you'll see the high points in the past, 1998, 2010, 2016, those high, very warm years were all El Nino years. These are years where this El Nino phenomenon in the Pacific is moving up warm water into the surface and exchanging that warmth into the surface of the ocean and the atmosphere. So those years are warmer than others. This 2020 was not an El Nino year. In fact, half of the year was La Nina, moving into a cooler phase. So this tells us something, that we are really moving on a fast march to a warming Earth. And if you're aware of what we're trying to do globally, you're familiar with the target that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has sort of indicated of a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming that we don't want to cross. And you can see from this chart, we're getting close. So the point I want to make here is that I don't have time to convince you but basically state in very simple terms, it is real. Climate change is real. It's not fake news. It's not phony. It is happening, and it's result of our activities. All of the warming can be explained by human activities. There's nothing else going on other than humans driving the train now. The experts agree. I don't know if you've seen the news today, but two of the deniers who were put into the administration just a few months ago have now been dismissed by the Trump administration. So because they're so outliers. So the experts agree not only on the warming trend, but on the causes of the warming. And it's bad, although there's some potential benefits in some parts of the world for a warming world. Overall, the consequences are not good for the planet, for biodiversity that Paula talked about, or for us, humankind. But having said that, the important thing you need to understand, there is hope. This is not, that we have to accept the long-term consequences. We can do something about it to reduce the effects, both by reducing the rate of warming and by getting prepared for it. And we need to do that. And part of what Paula talked about in terms of these protecting global biodiversity hotspots is very important in that preparing, adapting to the climate change. On the other hand, if we don't limit the rate of climate change, if we let it just grow and warm, we will lose biodiversity no matter how successful we are with protecting environments around the world. So these two issues that we're talking about tonight are joined at the hip. They're interrelated, and we need to think of them in those terms. So just as that you can understand that here's that same curve, but kind of on a different scale, showing the observed temperature change. And the question, of course, is what's going to happen into the future? And the answer to that question is it depends on our emissions. If we continue to emit greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in particular, the planet will continue to warm. That's this RCP 8.5 trajectory. If we continue growing those emissions at the rate we've seen in the recent past, we're in for a very warm world, approximating 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees or so Fahrenheit on that global average, and extreme conditions and of high temperatures around the world. If, on the other hand, this is where the hope comes in, if we are able to reduce our emissions, PDQ, pretty damn quickly, we can limit the rate of warming. We can't stop it on a dime, but we can stabilize it below 2 degrees Celsius, or maybe even 1.5 if we do it aggressively. But we need to do it quickly. We'll talk about that. We need to reduce those emissions, sometime get to net zero on a global basis, sometime before 2060. If we don't do it, we're going to go at a higher level. And the important thing about temperature, global temperature, is that it can be stabilized, and it can be stabilized pretty quickly once we achieve that net zero level. So those are the choices we have: a very much warmer world, extraordinarily warmer world, or a world that's warmer than we have today, but we can stabilize and begin to cool it down over time. The existential choice, not only for the Eastern Shore, but for the globe. So before I go and talk about sea level rise, I just want to point out there are many, many other consequences to the people who live on Delmarva of climate change. They include just heat waves. As someone who likes to get outdoors and exercise, just the fact that you will have a rare, we're headed for a time when we have a rare day where we have temperatures below 90 degrees. And you'll have weeks of summer periods where temperatures are excess of 100 degrees. So just even beyond the health risk to vulnerable people, there are consequences to people like me who like to exercise and so on. Extreme rainfall events. We've already seen some of those in our region as a result of the changing climate. But the interesting thing is that while there are more incidents of extreme rainfall events, there are going to be more prolonged droughts as well. So the extremes vary and intensify as we move forward. Water supply. On Delmarva, you have no large-scale rivers and surface water supplies. You rely on groundwater. So the more water we draw out to irrigate crops and so on, it threatens the groundwater supply, which is not going to be replaced by recharge as quickly as we would like. And then, of course, the Delmarva fox squirrel is the icon for Delmarva on this biodiversity issue that Paula talked about, why that's really important, and why the Delmarva, because of its status and development, in fact, it's got a lot of land that can be held in conservation, is really a key test case on a regional scale for managing climate change, but also managing our regional biodiversity. So sea level rise. First of all, I have to tell you, I've met with many over the years, many people. I've talked to many groups on the Delmarva area about sea level rise, and you will find people, and I've found many of them who will come up to you and tell you, he says, "Look, I don't believe this. I've been living on the water for 20 years, and the water level is just where it is. Sea level's not rising." Well, sir, in fact, it is. What you're seeing is variations, and you're missing the noise. But you're missing the signal for the noise. But here is the evidence from both Baltimore, where we have long-term going back to almost 1900 record of tide gauge measurements. And here is Lewis, where you've got not quite as long a period. And you can see that we've got roughly equivalent, slightly more in Lewis. In fact, in Cambridge and others, slightly higher rates of relative sea level rise as determined by tide gauges over this period. What you can't necessarily see from these local records, but you can when you pull it all together on a global basis, and particularly since 1993, we've been able to have measurements of sea level around the world that aren't just based on these tide gauges, because these tide gauges vary in terms of their record length, but also most importantly, the land along the coast is rising in some places, falling in others, so you've got to figure that out. In our area, the sea level actually is, the land is subsiding. So even before we've got this human effect on sea level, the land has been sinking. So that's why some of the islands that in the Chesapeake Bay that were inhabited during the colonial period, they eroded away and were subsided away because of subsidence. But now on top of that, during the 20th century, we have this rise of sea level. So the point that now that we have this record, this global record of sea level rise from, of all things, satellites, which are able to measure very precisely the distance between the satellite and the surface of the land or the surface of the ocean, very precisely. So with lots and lots of these passes and records, we've now been able to understand the pattern of sea level rise over the whole globe. And what this record here on this graph shows you is that, yes, indeed, it's increasing, but you'll see that that black line in it has a curve to it. It's not a straight line, it's slightly going upwards. So this is the acceleration of sea level rise because of increased rates of warming, and particularly what's contributing to that is we've got more and more contribution to the volume of the ocean, not just because the ocean is expanding because it's getting warmer, but also, and glaciers are melting, but also now the polar ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica, are kicking in. This wasn't the case back even in the 70s. There was virtually no net in contribution of polar ice sheets to sea level rise at that time. Now it's beginning to dominate that trend. So the big question again is what's going to happen in the future? And of course, the answer is it depends on us. So here you see two scenarios. These are the same ones we talked about with respect to the warming of the temperature that we talked about. So here's the growing emissions. We let emissions grow, continue to grow till the end of the century. Then we figure out we've got a holy mess and we start to do something about it, or we do something about it now. And doing something about it now is what was intended by the Paris Climate Agreement that you remember, that the outgoing president basically is attempting to withdraw this country, and the incoming president wants to enter. So here are the choices, Delmarva, that you have in terms of sea level rise. If you can take action now, you can reduce emissions and maybe have, and as we'll see in particular, another foot and a half of sea level rise during the century, or you can let it rip, don't be concerned, and have a good part of the coastal region of Delmarva inundated. The only thing you can do about that is to reduce emissions, not only here in Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, but around the world. The kicker, the unknown, the wild card in this that we need to avoid testing is Antarctica, because we have potential for very rapid rates of sea level rise if the ice sheets in Antarctica, the glaciers in Antarctica which are melting largely because the ocean around Antarctica is becoming warmer, might slip into the sea, causing more rapid rates of sea level rise. So this is why that action is urgent, because we need to take action, not 20 years from now, not 50 years from now, but now. This is the generation that that will determine that outcome. My grandchildren, your grandchildren, they're the ones who will bear the consequences, but they can't do anything about it. It's us, okay? So that's, and I'll come back to that point toward the end. So just to let you know, when I have, over the period that I served on the Climate Change Commission, I led efforts to try to give us the best estimates of sea level rise for Maryland. These estimates, I think, are generally appropriate for the other parts of Delmarva as well, other parts of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia as well. So I think they can be a useful guide. Now, it's not a simple, straightforward thing to figure this out. I showed you the global picture, but the local sea level rise is affected by a number of other factors. One of them I mentioned, the land sinking, that has to be factored in. The other is that the ocean currents change with sea level rise. So that affects the distribution of how currents affect water levels along, say, the Atlantic coast, and the Pacific coast and the like. And then the other part of that, as the glaciers, as the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland melt, I don't have time to explain it, but there's a gravitational effect. So you lose a lot of mass of ice and Greenland. And you all know about gravity. We learned in grammar school, or high school at least, that gravity is an attraction between two bodies. As that mass diminishes in Antarctica, it's the gravitational effect that pulls the sea water to Greenland is relaxed. So that causes the water to retreat. So the Greenland, sea level around Greenland actually decreases, but it increases with distance. Same thing for Antarctica. So we have to figure that out, where we are with respect to Greenland and Antarctica and how that works. So I just wanted to tell you that it's not a simple, straightforward way to estimate what it means for a local region like Delmarva. So these are our estimates. And again, using the same scenarios, the Paris Agreement say that's the 2.6, and the growing emissions 8.5. And you can see even during this century, it makes a big difference. So we could take action now and have maybe a 2 foot, better than even chance of having less than 2 feet of sea level rise from the beginning of this century. We had 1 foot of sea level rise in last century, or we cannot, and risk the effect of having maybe up to 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, and even more as we go forward. What does this mean? 4 feet of sea level rise. Here's the area where I worked for a good period of my life in Cambridge, Maryland. You can see the neck district of Dorchester County. Blackwater is all underwater. It's part of the Chesapeake Bay at that point. Similarly, for areas in Delaware, you can see here centered around Lewis, both in the Delaware Bay side and the coastal bays, tremendous amount of inundation effect. But beyond that, there are many other effects. First of all, there's this issue of shoreline erosion. As sea level rises, it causes the waves have more power and can erode the shoreline. If you're familiar with the Delmarva at all, it doesn't have to go far to find these issues of ghost forest. This is where marshes are moving backwards and into forest and leaving these ghost trees remaining. Marshes are being lost as well. And if we constrain that retreat by protecting areas, we're going to reduce the amount of wetlands. The picture on the upper right shows a sunny day, but with high water levels, not related to a tropical storm or anything. And here you see cars looking like boats trying to cross a bridge and neighborhoods flooded. This is this idea of high tide flooding or sunny day flooding that we're seeing now increasingly in areas like Baltimore, Annapolis, and of course areas along the Cambridge and other areas along the shore. And then, of course, this other issue, which has drawn a lot of attention recently, is that if you have a high tide interval, it becomes, encroaches and becomes higher, it leaves salty water on the land. And that has an effect of a tremendous devastating effect on agriculture. So we're losing agricultural land because of this tidal flooding, which puts salt in the soil and therefore makes it so that you can't grow crops anymore. Here's just a model that shows you what the consequences may be. Again, the same scenarios of sea level rise we have, and you can see these little black bars, and this is for Baltimore, but you could do the same thing for Annapolis, where if you've been down to City Dock in Annapolis on a high tide day and see the parking lot and the road underwater, you know what I mean. And you can see how that will increase in frequency past the middle of this century as a result of this, which is going to require a lot of thinking about how we protect existing older infrastructure. And it's going to also require a lot of thinking about whether we protect or abandon some of the low-lying areas where people live. So in terms of options for adaptation, don't have time to go into all of them, but basically we can plan for it. We can create regulations that govern how people respond to it. We can manage land change as we go forward, and we can put structural barriers, flood walls and levees and things of this sort. But that, of course, means that it's expensive to protect areas that are lightly populated, and maybe in the long run it fails even in more valuable and populated areas. And there's also many nature-based approaches, soft approaches of living shorelines, for example, of things that we can do. All of those are being pursued in all three of our states, both Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, have plans and programs to work on this. One in Maryland is called the Coast Smart program, which is in law, that requires the state not to make investments in areas that are can be prone to this inundation and increased over time. But the most important thing, if people ask you, what can you as a citizen do, is to aggressively, actively support our government's policies at state and national levels to reduce our emissions because of the graphs I showed you, because that's the end game. If we don't do that now, we will lose a lot. We will be in an unmanageable situation in the future. So in Maryland, fortunately, progressively, we've had a number of things. We've got legislation that requires clean California standard cars. We're in a regional compact to cap and trade for our emissions from power plants that not only Maryland is in, but Delaware is in, and more recently, Virginia is joined. Maryland, we have a commission on climate change. There's similar commissions and efforts in Delaware and Virginia. In Maryland, we have this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, which in the latest version, 2016, was a 40% reduction of our emissions by 2030. We think we've made the first one of 25% by 2020 already, assisted last year by COVID, of course, even more so. But we think there's a reasonable path forward to get a 40% reduction by 2030 in Maryland. Beyond that, though, we need more aggressive approaches. There we have a new renewable portfolio of standards that require your electricity to have certain percentage to come from renewable sources. And then all of our three states are in this US Climate Alliance states. Now, so Maryland's present law, which is the 2019 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, the Hogan administration came out with the draft plan. That's never been finalized yet. It was late and it's been delayed, and it's never been finalized, which has a pathway. And that pathway says we're going to make the 40% reduction. But if you can look at that graph, the red line, it shows you, yeah, you might be able to reach the 40% reduction, but you don't have a plan to get to where we need to go by 2050. That is to get to net zero by 2050. There is in this, and it was submitted last year in our abbreviated session, there was no time to pass, and it will be resubmitted, a Climate Solutions Act, which is a pathway to get us the requirement that is a state. Maryland is committed legally to reach zero emissions by 2045. Now, having said that, might sound like we're going way out on the limb, but look, around this country, states are making this commitment. Around the world, we have the UK, the European Union, Japan, Korea, and about over 100 other countries have made this commitment. Even China, that villain China has made a commitment to reach net zero, not by 2050, but by 2060. It's a big developing nation and has to have a lot of things to do. So we need to join that. In fact, our new president has made that commitment. So as a citizen, you can help this debate. You can help our society, global society, move forward to achieve this. If we do, we can manage sea level rise. We can ensure biodiversity by protecting habitat and do all these things. There is hope. It is not the end of the world. We can make it. We can solve this. We can survive it. And we can make it better. But the key factor is this right here on this graph. We need to find a way to eliminate our net greenhouse gas emissions. So thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much, Don. So we actually have a good bit of questions in the chat, so I'm just gonna jump right into it. So we have a question, I believe it's from Jim George. 1 second. And he asked if you could briefly discuss ocean and coastal acidification and why it's not as baked in as sea level rise is.
Well, thanks, Jim. I didn't mention it because of the time constraints, but as my friend, former NOAA administrator, Jane Lubchenco labeled it, ocean acidification is climate change's evil twin. Now, ocean acidification happens not because of climate change, but because of the common root cause, that is the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more that's going to be dissolved in the ocean. And just like your soda gets CO2, is high concentrations of CO2, it's acidic. You can actually clean things with Coke because of its acidity. The same thing for the ocean. So what we see is this ocean acidification, growth of ocean acidification around the world, commensurate with an increase of CO2. In a place like the Chesapeake Bay, for example, there is a wide range of pH. This is the amount of acidity in the water, because that occurs because of the high levels of production and decomposition and so on. So the estuarine areas are somewhat used to that variation, but even there, they're not immune. So we need to solve both problems together, both the global warming problem, climate change problem, and the CO2 problem. The only way to do it is to cap and limit, don't let the CO2 concentrations in the air grow. That's why we need to reduce emissions for both ocean acidification, to limit ocean acidification, to limit climate change.
Thank you for answering that, Don. All right, so a couple more. Kelsey asked, is there any way to get states that are not seeing impacts of climate change now to adapt to change the types of changes that Maryland is implementing? And how many states are actively participating in these programs?
There are no states that aren't experiencing the effects of climate change, first of all. And in fact, there are, I forget how many now there are on this climate coalition there, but they're over half of the states, over 25% of the states are in it. Now, I mentioned earlier that I come from the state of Louisiana. That's my home state. That state is arguably more threatened by climate change than any other. The whole third of the lower part of the state is no more than 3 feet above sea level. It's got it. Talk about an existential challenge. It's facing it. It's also a big petroleum producer, oil and gas producer. So it faces this dilemma, Okay, and that's been handicapped it because the oil interest and the people worried about jobs and so on say, we can't do anything about climate change. There's a governor in Louisiana now who's just elected to a second term, and he has actually broken the mold because he said we need to protect our coast, we need to protect our environment, and do everything we can to adapt to this change. But we need to limit climate change. So even in a place like Louisiana, you see this shift where the governor now has a commission that's going to address reducing emissions, just like we created one here in Maryland several years ago. And he's got oil and gas interests at the table. So what they've got to figure out is how to survive this and how to manage their economy, but also not kill them and all of us at the same time. So you're going to see this, I think, around the world. You're already seeing it, and you're going to see it in this country, where those states that are complete denial and don't think there's a problem, they are not immune, and they're going to be having to address it. Plus, but in addition to that, we need this national policy because so many things are governed at the national level that we can't do, certainly at the local level, but can't even do at the state level.
Thank you for answering that. So we have a couple more for you. So yeah, another one that's kind of focused on that macro level. Jared Parks asked, how is the rapidly expanding world population factored into these models?
Well, I think Paula dodged that question with respect to the effects on biodiversity. And I think, frankly, it is. I mean, because the more people, the more we consume, the more resources we use, the more land we take. So we do need to think about our population and limiting our population. It doesn't mean that we have to kill people off. We can survive. We can manage our population, the carrying capacity. I mentioned when we met earlier today, Paula Ehrlich, when I saw her name, reminded me, there's a legendary biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich, who back in the 70s started this movement of zero population growth to reduce our growth of our human population so that we can live within the carrying capacity of the earth. The way, interestingly, you see around the world, this has happened. You know, population growth has come down, and it's come down even in some developing nations. Interesting. You know what the number one reason why it's come down? Because we've empowered women. Because women are taking control of their lives and limiting their populations for their own benefits. So one of the things that we can do with population growth is not just saying, well, we're doomed because of population growth. We can help stabilize it, but the way to do it is to work on social equity and allow people to control their lives. So I think these two things of social equity and dealing with climate change really go hand in hand.
Agreed. Some people say women will save the world, so I believe it. So we have two more questions for you. So Tammy says, utility solar installations raise in local temperatures. How can this be countered?
Well, I'm not sure. I haven't read the literature on that, but it's conceivable that they do. Where you have a solar farm field, but I'm aware, the literature I'm aware of is that that's not a big factor on a larger scale. That may be a local effect, but it doesn't raise the temperatures of the state of Maryland that's experienced on a broader scale of the states of Maryland or Delaware and so on. It's potentially a local effect. There's also concerns that we have to work out with things like wind energy. You know, speaking of biodiversity, there's the concern about mortality of birds and so on, bats and so on that are affected by those wind turbines. We need to think creatively about how to fix that. And there are ways to limit that effect, just like as will be with these. You know, one of the interesting things, I don't know whether any of the participants saw, but it just struck me just earlier today or yesterday, whenever it was an article about that some of my colleagues in the university are working on, of someone trying to solve multiple problems at the same time. This is a couple of companies are proposing a barge with solar panels on it that they can put out in the bay away from shorelines where people are concerned about to grow oysters and use the solar energy to empower the system to manage the oyster, clean the oysters and to manage them. So those are the kinds of creative solutions that we need. When we start putting these challenges together, we can find as a people.
Thank you, Don. All right, so last question, kind of alluded to it already, but have wind speeds statistically increased over the last 50 years? And is there anything else you'd like to elaborate further with that question?
I don't know. I don't know whether speeds here, in our region have, but there is evidence that wind speeds and waves in the ocean, coastal ocean in general, have increased. And it's not complicated. Is that so that if you heat up areas, the wind, the air goes up, right? Warm air rises. And so that requires more air to flow to those areas that you're heating. So the surface of the winds around the world increase in a warming world, just as this issue of increased rainfall, because you're evaporating more water from the oceans, it's got to come down. So those are the kinds of effects on weather, is that result. Weather, I mean, like whether it's windy today or rainy today, that are affected as the world warms. A more energetic world is created.
Gotcha. All right, well, thank you so much, Don. You have no more questions, but again, really appreciate you for being a part of this and sharing a really important presentation. I really think a lot of folks are going to get some good information out of this.
Thanks.
So thanks again. So with that being said, I want to take it on to our next speaker, the man that needs no introduction. Yeah, so I want to introduce ESLC's president, Rob Etkin. And, he's also our founder. He's been with ESLC since 1990 and has seen, everything that we've done and been behind it. So he's going to share a little bit about Delmarva Oasis with you all. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks, Darius. I know it's getting late. I just want to give you a little bit of idea of what we're up to here, because there was a lot of hope in Paula's speech and also in Don's, but these are sobering challenges. And at Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, we've been grappling with them, and now have a new strategic plan that is committing us to some pretty bold action. So I just want to lay that out real quick. Hang with us, and I'll take a few questions, and then we'll be wrapping up for the evening. So we're calling it Delmarva Oasis, but it's really modeled in part on Paula's and the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation's Half Earth initiative, Half Earth project. But we are striving to protect 50% of Delmarva by 2030. Which is a very aggressive timeline. And basically, we feel like, and I'll give you a little bit of this data as we go forward, but if we accelerate our efforts now, we can accomplish a lot of the things that Paul is trying to accomplish on a global level. We can do it right here at home. And we feel a responsibility that Delmarva's got the largest contiguous block of prime farmland really north of coastal plain North Carolina. So we're within an overnight's drive of about a third of the nation's food consumers, and we feel that brings a responsibility to try to meet that demand. So we're also focused on trying to protect land for food production and do it in a way where we can have our habitat and eat it too, in other words. But why Delmarva? Folks that live here know this. People that live on Delmarva do it by choice. And a lot of animals and plants all make those same choices. We are we are nestled right here. This satellite image really shows New York on the right side, Manhattan, all the way down to Norfolk on the left side. And you can see the I-95 corridor there going right around Delmarva. So we are smack dab in the middle of the Eastern megalopolis. And yet Delmarva is an amazing place. there's a lot of things going on here. Don mentioned the Delmarva fox squirrels, but we really are, our mid-coastal location gives us, I mean, of course, we're migratory habitat for all the birds, the waterfowl, the songbirds that migrate through the area, and other species, the butterflies, insects. But we're also the northern limit for a lot of southern species. We're the southern limit for a lot of northern species. So it really is an Eden right here in the mid-Atlantic. And I mentioned farming, but suffice it to say, farming is a key part of our heritage here. And it's also a key responsibility for our region to play on the East Coast. And I want to mention one other thing. So we've got species loss, we've got sea level rise and climate change. We also have that megalopolis circling around us. We've got a new Bay Bridge somewhere in the midshore here on the horizon. We also have new transportation improvements on the north side of the peninsula to connect Route 301 over to Route 1. And we've got a new twin tubes coming at the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. So in fairly short order, we're going to be set up to be an eastern bypass of the Route 95 corridor, and that will bring a whole nother Pandora's box of development pressure and unknown pressures, economic as well as otherwise, and good and bad, but largely we have to figure out how to control these. And Don talked a lot about sea level rise. I won't talk more about that at this point, except to say that we are recognized as the third most susceptible region in the country. Now, this is where I want to spend a minute. So the map on the left shows protected lands on Delmarva. So that it doesn't look like a very good pattern, but we have got a lot done already. If you look at Delaware, they're about 26% protected already. So they're more than halfway toward the goal of 50%. And a lot of their coastal areas are protected. They've done a magnificent job of protecting that coastline, really from Newcastle almost all the way down to Cape Henlopen. It's really an amazing job. It took a lot of years and a lot of cooperation. If you look at Maryland, we've got a little more volume of land protected. We're at about 30% protected in Maryland. But as you can see, our patterns are not ideal. And this is hearkening back to Paula's discussion. And in Virginia, believe it or not, Virginia is the star pupil on Delmarva. They're about 40% protected, in large part because of all of the barrier islands that were bought up by the Nature Conservancy and state and federal government over the years. They've just done a magnificent job with protection there. So that's where we stand today in terms of land protection. But if you look at the map on the right, what we're trying to do is knit that land protection in part by escalating the land protection on peninsula. We really want to get up, the whole peninsula is about 30% protected now. And so we feel like if we get that up to 50% protected, which is about another 750,000 acres, no small feat, but if we get there and we focus that effort on building out our, what we call green infrastructure, or really our riparian corridors, our river corridors, and knitting them together with larger hubs of habitat that are required for species diversity, that we can really have a built infrastructure to allow our species to survive over the long term and our food production to survive. It's not hard to imagine with Don's maps that as the sea level rises and our rivers and our salt wedge goes further and further up gradient, that we will need to allow those habitats to migrate. So salt marshes that exist around, that go up to perhaps the Marshy Hope River right now on the Nanticoke, will go up further inland. So we need to have those riparian corridors secured with protection so that that habitat can migrate over time, and the species dependent on it need to migrate over time. And salt marsh habitat's a good example. You know, there is a lot of concern about the salt marsh sparrow being listed soon as an endangered species. So their numbers are in precipitous decline. I also want to mention, you know, Paula talked about, we really only understand or have named about 20% of the species on the planet. And even here on Delmarva, our ecology is a lot simpler than it is in Madagascar, for example. But even right here, we know very little about the species that inhabit this place. I mean, we just bought last year a 1,200-acre property that's now a wildlife management area, and near Church Hill, called Browns Branch Wildlife Management Area. And we bought it and worked with the state to get it protected because it is the largest chunk of remaining habitat to protect the dwarf wedge mussel, which is a federal endangered species. That's a good thing. But while we were investigating this and we were walking in the streams looking for dwarf wedge mussels, we saw this migration of brook lamprey, and now that, which is a state endangered species. Now, I've been in the water on the bay my entire life, as have many people I know, and none of us have ever seen a brook lamprey. And here they are migrating up this watershed, and it turns out they probably have a symbiotic relationship with dwarf wedge mussels. And people, you know, the scientists in the state, and no offense, Don, but we just don't know enough. We haven't invested enough in good science to know about these species. So we have to proceed with great caution, but we do have confidence that this hubs and corridors strategy is what's needed to secure most of our species over the long term. Great economic benefits to doing this between farming and seafood and tourism, as you know. So I'll just wrap it up with this proposition that what we're trying to do with Delmarva Oasis is immediately ramp up conservation efforts towards a goal of 50% of Delmarva protected by 2030. And that sounds like a lot, but we're already at near 30%. It represents, since we only have 10 years to do it, it represents about a quadrupling in the pace of land conservation over what we're doing now. We need to focus these efforts on critical restoration opportunities in these riparian corridors. We really need to build out our green infrastructure right now so we can have migration corridors for these species that are going to be pushed around by climate change and sea level rise. And we know for our community standpoint, we have to connect our economy to this conservation effort. If people aren't going to be able to make a living from this place, then we're not going to get the public support we need. So with that, I will wrap it up and invite any questions if we have enough time, Darius.
We've got questions. So the first question, and thank you for that presentation, Rob. Really appreciate you. The first question is from Summer Crosby, who is really looking to combine the first two presentations with this. But she asked, how do we protect landscapes with changing underlying conditions? In other words, sea level rise, changing temperatures, changing elevations for particular habitats, et cetera, et cetera. Can we use our climate science to inform which areas need to be protected as habitats migrate with climate change?
Yeah, and there's actually good science on that. We have a partner in the Delmarva Conservation and Restoration Network that's worked out science. Congressman Wayne Gilchrist, when he was in Congress in 2003, launched a similar initiative called the Delmarva Conservation Corridor, and the Fish and Wildlife Service actually did some extensive science and mapping about the corridors that are needed to secure, that are enlightened by climate change science, but that mapped out really what our priorities are for Delmarva Peninsula. So there's lots of good data around already. We have done a good job with that.
Thank you.
Darius, if I could just add that, just amend what Rob said. You know, we have to prepare for what's coming as well as try to protect what might be going. You know, so thinking about the Delmarva, one of the characteristics is that it's the northern end, of cypress swamp, for example. And as things warm up, there are going to be expansion opportunities for cypress. You might see cypress able to come in the upper part of the Choptank River system, like it is in the upper Pocomoke. So I mean, we have to think of the world as it will be, as well as the world as it is, as we plan for this future.
Yeah, no question. We see it all the time. I've been bird watching here my whole life, and just the incidence of brown-headed nuthatches, for example, has crept in that short time period, has crept north fairly significantly right here in the midshore area. So we do see it all the time, and it's obvious that if we build out our natural corridors, mostly our riparian corridors, and build on our larger hubs of habitat, we can do a lot for species survival over the long term.
Great. Thank you both for tag teaming that one.
Yes.
Okay, so I have a couple more. So when you talk
I was
about,
going to say, if I could just weigh in on that a little bit too, Darius, I think one of the kind of things I hope comes through, and Rob, you said this really well, is that we need to know more about what's there. And in some sense, that it's only with that baseline understanding of which species are where today that we'll be able to assess the impacts on biodiversity under potential future scenarios, right? And be able to establish those kinds of conservation priorities. And it's just fascinating to hear you talk, Rob, about actually seeing this in real time, but knowing that it's there helps us to be able to plan for that. And and really digging in on that science is something that's critically important, I think, in this moment. And the thing is that we now have the technology to do it, right? In previous, times, we didn't have the big data and the remote sensing and the other tools allow us to really monitor these kinds of, to get a handle on species on the ground. So just wanted to reemphasize that point, because I think it does help us fit this all together a little bit, taking that global view, but realizing that really the science at both levels is critically important.
Thank you, Paula. Appreciate it. Got a lot stirred up from that question. All right, so we definitely have a few more. They're rolling in. So somebody asks, Eva asks, when you talk about agricultural preservation, are you talking only about the commodity crops that are currently here? And will there be any aspect of this plan that incentivizes small farmers that grow food for people instead of animals?
We work actively. So the Delmarva Oasis initiative is really a scale and volume initiative. And in the farmland preservation efforts, there'll be additional efforts to rise the floor on stewardship of all those protected lands. But the distinction between sort of cash grain operations and more local food-based operations is an important one. We feel like there's a lot more room to run with our consumer base in this region in food production. And so we think there's room for all of the above. And we work very actively with the Next Generation Farmland Protection Program and other small farm programs to help the small producer get going. It's a difficult dynamic out there, as we all know.
Thank you. And Susan asks, does regenerative farming have a role in reaching the 50% goal? Yeah.
Yes. One of the things that Jim and Tyler are looking at, and we're working with some colleagues even at the University of Maryland. So carbon sequestration in agricultural soils we're at the beginning of understanding how to do that. Around the country, we do a good job of sequestering carbon in forest soils, and California has an active market. But it's a cap and trade kind of sort of mechanism that Don talked about. But we think with our soil base here, and there's a great possibility to really build our soils, use that as a carbon sequestration or a carbon sink to help the global situation, at the same time improving our soils, improving their productivity, improving their water quality benefits of the rain that falls on those soils. So there's a lot of upsides with regenerative soils management here, and everybody's scrambling as fast as they can to get a better handle on it. But I think we'll get there, and I think we'll even have some economic benefits from it, given our scale and our location here.
Thank you. All right, another one for you. Liz Feinberg asks, are local land use and land development policies in the region supportive of conservation or in conflict with these goals?
Generally supportive. I will say 15 years ago and before, there was significant work to be done with local land use regulations, but all of the counties where we work on the shore, and I think even the lower shore of Maryland, have really gone accelerated to the head of the class, and all of our counties are now in the most protected category for rural zoning. So we've really, in this region, come a long way. Now, its implementation is a little variable, but generally, just in the life of the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, I can tell you that there was subdivisions everywhere not following comprehensive plans back in the early 90s. And in fact, about 80% of new growth back in the early 90s was going outside of towns, on farms or waterfronts, on septics. And now we're getting over 80% of our new growth in our towns on septic systems, on public transportation within a walkable and bikeable distance to amenities that people need during the day. So it's really the local land use planning regime on the shore, and thanks to strong leadership from the state, but it's really turned around in the last 2 decades or so. It's really, they deserve a lot of credit. Local governments have really worked hard on that, and state government provided a lot of leadership under several governors.
So on that government perspective, we have a few questions on that. So we have one from Timothy Wheeler who asks, can you achieve this quadrupling of land conservation through private and nonprofit efforts, or do you need buy-in from federal, state, and especially local governments? Which drives the bus in terms of land use and development?
Yeah, we need buy-in from federal, state, and local governments, particularly on that farmland preservation one. The state and local governments, with some federal participation, have done an excellent job with farmland preservation, and we're going to need that to accelerate. And I think we can get there from here. They're very willing partners. So it's going to take everyone. It's going to take a stronger private sector role. It's going to take stronger private sector funding in this. The state of Maryland has really been it's sort of been a tragedy of riches. You know, program open space in Maryland has been such a strong and steady and politically popular funding source for getting land protection done for a very long time. And I won't say taken it for granted, it's been amazing, but we need to get more private sector involvement in that and push for a stronger federal role.
So you have one more question from Dan Watson, and he asks, does ESLC's Oasis program have the express backing or endorsements of any state or local government jurisdiction? Have any state or local politicians stepped up?
That's a good question, Dan. All my buddies. But I will say that we have briefed Maryland and Delaware's state government, and we've made attempts to, we've done some mid-level briefings in Virginia, but I will say the Hogan administration and the Carney administration in Delaware have been very supportive. And in fact, I have to give Delaware a lot of credit. They have been very enthusiastic about joining into a regional effort to get more land protected. I think they were a little sore that they were lagging behind the other states on the raw statistic. So they have got the bit in their teeth, and they are doing more land protection than the Maryland, Eastern Shore counties, or Virginia by far now. And a lot of that credit goes to Michael Scoose from the Delaware Department of Agriculture, but also Sean Garvin from their DENREC agency, and Governor Carney and all the nonprofit partners that are working hard over there. It's really been good to see.
Say, Rob, what are your plans to take advantage of that? We're going to have a president from a native of the region.
Yeah, I think I am hopeful. I know the president has a lot on his plate these days, or he will when he comes in, but I'm hoping he doesn't forget about Delmarva. So we'll be doing everything we can, and we've got great partnerships with Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, and many other organizations that are all pushing in the same direction. So we're hopeful that the new administration can really be a boom time for conservation work, but we also recognize that
there's other challenges. This is a small ask.
yeah, that's true.
All right, well, that concludes all the questions. Rob, thank you so much for that presentation. Don and Paula, thank you so much for joining in on some of those questions and stirring up some additional conversation as well.
Darius, can I make one closing remark?
Shoot, go for it.
So Paula mentioned that John F. Kennedy, his famous quote, I don't have it exactly, I tried to write it down, Paula, but you quoted him saying, by the end of this decade, we're going to get this 800-ton or whatever he said, behemoth of a ship onto the moon. Well, it just made me think, I mean, by the end of this decade, we are going to protect 50% of Delmarva, and we're going to have a full build out on the habitat and green infrastructure for this peninsula to serve as a model for how to do it, and as a refuge for all the species and the people and the communities and the farmers that are using this wonderful place. We're going to do
it. You're here. All right, thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Everett. Thank you.
All right, so what I want to do next, and then we're getting to the end of the program, I actually want to introduce ESLC's Coastal Resilience intern, Tyler Chandler. And he's going to share a bit with you about an engagement activity that will interest some of you all in between these workshops. So I'm going to pull the slide up, and Tyler, it's all yours.
Thank you, Darius. Hi, everyone, and good evening. Thank you all for joining in to our workshop series. As part of these, we're trying to do something a little different and really trying to provide Delmarva residents with an activity that they can do that sort of will connect what you just learned with their community and the shore as a whole. And so with that, I'll go ahead and jump in. So the first engagement activity that we designed for our workshop series is called Photovoice. And it's really designed to give a voice to Delmarva residents, and it'll task every participant to express what their community means to them through the use of photography. So our version of Photovoice tasks participants to reflect on what they value most and to use photos to explain what objects or locations they would want to preserve for future generations. As all of you just heard, Delmarva is facing a crisis. Sea levels are continuing to rise and the climate is changing. And so this activity is designed to act as sort of a preservation of sorts. We want to see what Delmarva means to each and every one of you. And we want to do that by learning more about the shore and by just seeing what's out there. What places do you think are going to be threatened in the future? And so we want to challenge each of you to participate and to let your voice be heard throughout this activity. The top stories and photos will be highlighted across our social media channels, and the top place winners will be eligible for a prize. If you're interested in this activity, we'll be spreading it across our social media channels and our Facebook page, which is linked there below and will be sent out tomorrow afternoon probably. And we would encourage everybody to participate and to send your photos towards us. And if applicable, to have a brief write-up about why it's important to you and why you want to preserve it for your grandkids, your kids, or just for future generations in general. And we hope that ESLC can provide families with a fun opportunity to get out there and to connect on a deeper level to this material, to see how it'll personally affect you going forward as our sea levels rise and our climate changes. So that I'll just keep it brief, but thank you all for joining, and I look forward to seeing your pictures and your stories. We will get the full write-up sent out either tomorrow morning or afternoon, and thank you so much.
Jim?
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Darius. Thank you to Paula, Don, and Rob for some awesome presentations. I hope that everybody still on the line with us thought that this was a worthwhile use of their time. I hope that we were able to communicate to you some of our concerns for the region in terms of land protection, climate change, how we live and how we work and how we survive here on the Delmarva Peninsula. There are so many things that make this region really unique, really special. And there are some awesome things that we can do to make sure that this is a safe, viable, and healthy community for us, for our children and our grandchildren for years and years to come. So as I think that you saw, we painted with a pretty broad stroke this evening. Thank you, Paula, for giving us an overview of the Half Earth Project. Don, thank you for making it a little bit more specific to the Delmarva region and focusing on climate change, climate change impacts. And Rob, I really appreciate you making it really specific and really local, talking about the Delmarva Oasis initiative and how ESLC is going to be helping to steer this ship in the future. In forthcoming workshops, we're going to be talking about things that we touched on this evening. Next week, or the next workshop in 3 weeks, is going to be carbon sequestration on Delmarva. The third workshop 3 weeks after that is going to be touching on nature-based solutions and community solutions to deal with climate change impacts. And then the final workshop is going to be all about making an individual impact. What can we be doing at the individual level to make a difference in our own backyard, here in our block, at the neighborhood level, in our town? So I think that everything that you hear in subsequent workshops is going to tie back to what we learned tonight. Each one is going to continue to build and build on what we've already discussed. The engagement activity that Tyler mentioned is also going to inform the subsequent workshops. What you guys capture with Photovoice, what you guys choose to share with us through the Photovoice project is going to be helpful, particularly as we get to the final workshop about identifying ways that we can make a difference in our community. So I'm really excited about where we're going with the rest of this workshop series, and I'm so pleased with how all of this came together this evening. Again, I want to thank our sponsors at the Roush Foundation for making this possible. And I want to give a special thank you to each and every person who participated tonight. You make it all worth it. And this has been a whole lot of fun. Stay in touch with us and pay attention to our Facebook page for a recording of this and for other information to be shared related to the workshops. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our presenters. Good night.